Hi, I'm Ale. I did 4 years of PF at Blake, and then after that, I did 4 years of APDA at Chicago, which I just graduated from. I'm one of the CAs for Summer Open, and this is a lecture about the transition from PF to APDA. It will sort of assume at least some level of knowledge about the format. And if anything is ever unclear, feel free to message me on Facebook. So, what's the structure of this lecture? I think I'm going to talk about three big things. The first is sort of general differences between APTA and PF. I'm going to cover three big ones and how they should influence how you think about the format and how you think about the transition into it. Secondly, I'm going to sort of cover what you will be good at as a PFer going into APTA. I think one of the interesting things about APTA is that everyone kind of comes in with different skill sets, and so some of these skill sets are better suited for certain things than others. I don't think there's a single format that is better or worse than any other one. But they nonetheless do inform how you go about doing things. And so I want to talk about first what you're good at, so how do you exploit those advantages, and secondly, sort of what you'll not be so good at because of your BFer and how to minimize those comparative disadvantages. So the first big difference between APTA and PF is speech times. The shortest speech in PF is 2 minutes. The shortest speech in APTA is 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The longest speech in PF is 4 minutes, and the longest speech in APTA is 8 minutes and 30 seconds, which is a pretty big difference. Um, Having said that, what I'm talking about here is actually not about like filling the time. I think a lot of people are concerned about this when they go into APTA, which makes sense because you think, well, give 4 minutes speech most of the time. How can I fill 8 minutes and 30 seconds, especially without evidence? That will come naturally as you practice more and get more comfortable with the format. I don't think there's a thing you need to particularly do in order to get that skill. Um, there are, however, several implications that speech times do have that I think are actually more salient to understanding the transition. The first is there is considerably higher expectation for the depth of weighing and comparative analysis. So there's sort of generally a higher expectation for analysis given that the speeches are longer, but I think it's particularly important for weighing, which I think in PF, especially these days, people kind of get away with weighing that is incredibly slipshod and telegraphic. Like just saying we outweigh magnitude because of X, like literally one sentence, one liners is usually in PF like a reasonable enough argument. Or being like, probability is better than magnitude because it's what policymakers use, or magnitude is better than probability because even the infinite risk of a very small thing is enough. Like these kinds of like one sentence things that do communicate some kind of argument, but nonetheless maybe have missing premises or aren't terribly in depth. That kind of thing in APTA doesn't really win rounds, at least not frequently. In APTA, I think it's there's much more of a premium on just trying to like genuinely compare what the implications of two impacts are and how they influence each other. So things like short circuits and prereqs, which are big in PF, are also big in APTA as well. But there is typically at least it's just like sort of a more need for more rigorous impact comparison. Um, the second thing I'll say is that there's a lot more disinclination on the part of judges to vote on blips. And the reason why is a result of speech times, just to say that if you have enough time to present arguments in the full depth, the judges really don't want to vote on an argument that takes up 20 seconds of your final speech because it feels like a cheap shot. And since you had enough time to develop it further, if you didn't develop a winning argument further, it feels like you didn't even know what you were doing in the first place. So there is, I think, significantly higher threshold, both just like time wise, not even just an explanation, but also just like how much time you want to devote to just saying an argument and articulating it and explaining why it wins. That I think you'll have to kind of get used to in APTA. You might think like, oh, I've won this debate on this argument, I don't need to say anything more about it, and then lose. But I think, technically maybe you should be winning because it just didn't seem important. And that kind of decision is frustrating, but it is also remediable. And thinking about that in terms of like, since I have a lot of time, I might as well give arguments a little bit more depth. That can help you. The third thing I'll say is that there's more emphasis on communication. APTA has incredibly variable styles, which I think is one of the most wonderful things about the format. People debate in very different ways. There's some people who debate, very prettily, very nice rhetorically, and others who like kind of don't. And that's all well and good. But there is kind of an expectation, given how long the speeches are, that you do be making some like sort of active effort to communicate. So things like jokes, things like just like general through line statements, things like summaries of what you just went through or roadmaps that are done throughout the speech. Things that in PF would feel like wasted time. In APTA, they're usually not wasted. I think they genuinely help you keep a judge engaged for 8 minutes and 30 seconds and also just make you a more persuasive speaker generally. So I'm not going to tell you to like in PF when you're doing PF, like try to like work a bunch of jokes into your final focus because God knows that might not go very well. But in APTA, I think it is important to think about how can I make this speech not just like sort of a pieces on a chessboard type thing, but also like a genuine act of I'm talking to you as a person, and I want to keep that engaging. Um, the last thing I'll say is don't get lulled by the siren song of speech times being very long. In PF, there's obviously this huge emphasis on, in the final focus, you should only really have one or two arguments you're going for. In the summary, maybe two or three. But like generally speaking, there's much more need for a sort of condensation in PF. And so you might think, well, in APDA, I have like twice as much time, so I probably can, go for a little bit more stuff. I don't think that's a good idea, and I think the instinct of doing so is generally not going to go well. There is slightly more leeway, like some APTA PMRs, which is the final speech in APTA, can go for three arguments and be fine. Like, it's not a ridiculous thing to have ever seen. There's obviously, some scaling to this. But on the other hand, you should be careful to not give into it too much, and keep yourself, rigorously committed to the kinds of skills that you learn in PF, which is to say that you should collapse, and you should focus on certain specific things rather than trying to sort of spread yourself thin. And so not letting loose and still thinking with the rigorous mind that you have of like selecting arguments in the back half of the debate when you apply that to APTA will help you, and just don't let speech times sort of throw you off your instincts in that sense. The second big difference, obviously, is that there's no more evidence. There's no evidence in APTA. It's a parliamentary format, so everything is just off the dome, basically. This doesn't mean that research doesn't matter. You will need to do research both to write your own cases and also to know enough about topic areas in the world such that you are prepared to deal with whatever your opponent might throw at you. And so there's three things I think that are particular implications of not having evidence in APTA that you should be aware of. The first is that you will need to know more about more subject areas. I think there's a lot of PF topics that I did fine on that I didn't really know a lot of sort of the underlying mechanisms or the ways things worked. But because I had cards and I could understand the warrants from those cards, I largely came out of it fine. And the topics, once you debate enough on the same topic, people kind of know what arguments exist and don't exist. So it just becomes like everyone kind of knows what everyone is saying, even if none of them actually know what any of them are saying. In APA, that doesn't really work the same way. People will just read subject areas that are completely different than what you might expect. And you will not have the internet or research to back you up on it. So you will just need to know a little bit more. And I don't even mean like necessarily what people do in British parliamentary, which is like matter filing and looking up, The Economist every month or something like that. Though that certainly can help. But genuinely, it is kind of cool to be able to, think about philosophy or think about movement politics or whatnot as subjects, not only in and of themselves, but also in their debate implications. And so trying out different classes or just like scrolling through Wikipedia pages, all of these things are things that can help you in APTA much more than they would ever help you in PF, because you can just do them idly and end up storing up knowledge that sometime in the future might help you. The second thing is that there's a suite of arguments that you don't have anymore. And the suite of arguments that I even like evidence comparison. So like we have a card, they don't. Our card postdates their card. Our card is more specific on X question. Our expert is better than their expert, etc. I never loved these kinds of arguments, but they did exist and they were important to allow a lot of PFers debate it, especially when it comes to uniqueness questions. And so you will need to be able to discard those and still figure out ways to compare arguments that say the opposite thing or that are equally plausible. So thinking about, which warrants supersede other warrants, which arguments fit more generally well with the description of the world, which arguments sort of align better with the known incentives of actors. All of these different types of comparisons, which exist in PF but aren't sort of the whole ball game. In APTA, they kind of are the whole ball game, and you will need to get better at them as you go through it. So if you were thinking about this as someone who is still currently debating PF, well, one thing to think about is like, how can I approach comparison between opposite arguments? It's not just a question of like a card game, but rather a question of which of these arguments is genuinely true at sort of an underlying level, and how can I explain why that is the case? And sort of stemming off of that, you might want to change a little bit of how you do PF if you're still doing it, or if you still have people who in PF, or you still have access to PF drills or PF materials. I tend to find that there are certain things in PF that are actually exceptionally helpful for APTA, but only if they're done in certain ways. And what I mean by that is a couple of things. The first thing is like second rebuttal rebuilding. There's like two ways of doing it. There's one way of doing it that is like, your case, generally speaking, pretty well. Your opponents respond to it with whatever arguments they do, and you, thinking about those arguments and thinking about your case, respond to them with your mind. That will help you in APTA. That is just kind of what APTA is, actually. So if you are good at rebuilding, or the way that you do rebuilds is largely analytical and premised on knowledge of your case, but also just like familiarity with how to respond to sort of unconventional stuff, that will serve you well. If the way you do rebuilds is like very, very detailed blocks to everything that they could possibly say about a given argument that you already have pre-written, that's like a pretty good strategy in PF a lot of the time. In APTA, it won't translate quite as well. You can write blocks for when you're Gov, but because there isn't like a topic that everyone debates for the same month, the kinds of arguments you'll get are going to vary more across each other. So those blocks might be less helpful. And B, when you're opping, you just don't have blocks at all. So thinking more analytically about how you do PF, at least that particular skill might help you. The second thing is that I think reliance on the doc, especially in Final Focus and in summary, although in first summary, I think these days it's like pretty, it's pretty normal. But generally speaking, reliance on the doc is maybe something you should try to wean yourself off at least partly when you're doing these kinds of drills. That's not because in APTA you can't, use a document that you share with your partner or communicate. Like that's not it at all. But it is to say that I think going off the doc makes you more inclined to debate in ways that are more telegraphic or more related to the things that you sort of previously have written down. And I think APTA places more of a premium on improvisation and being willing to sort of roll with the punches or deal with debates that are a little bit different than what you expected. And so being willing to do that and so try out sort of jumps into the unknown, giving final focuses that are completely off the doc and just off the flow, that can help you a little bit if you were thinking about it that much in the future. Having said all of that, like I when I was doing PF, I didn't have a single thought about APTA. So this is sort of an unreasonable expectation. If you are someone who is just done with PF and we're sort of going into APTA and trying to learn about it, what I would think about is like when you were doing those things in PF, when you were giving second rebuttals, when you were giving final focuses, etc. What were the skills to sort of seem more related to APTA, and how can you hone those kinds of skills in particular? The third big thing that's different is there's a different case in every round. This is sort of underlined like some of the other things I was talking about. The implications of having a different case every round as opposed to a monthly topic are just enormous. Probably the biggest of the three of these things that I talked about. You will need to think on your feet quite quickly. In PF, there is some expectation that you do because people read arguments that are novel, or the back half goes a different way than you expected it to, etc. Like all these things do exist in PF, but having to form a whole case out of whole cloth in 15 minutes is definitely a higher level expectation of your ability to just sort of think on your feet. That's kind of a skill that there's not really an easy, like, number one way to quickly learn it. There are a lot of very smart people who did PF who debated in very analytical ways. And for those people, it might be a little bit easier. Like they're maybe more used to just generating arguments off the dome. I wasn't one of those people. And so for me, like the transition kind of took a little bit of work and took a little bit of debating. But eventually, I think it works out for most people. I will say there's four things that I think are more actionable in terms of how you can approach things. The first is that not everything is balanced. Most PF topics are quite balanced. There are exceptions. Back in the Stone Age, when I was a freshman, there was this universal background check topic that was very unbalanced because the AF was basically like, we should put very basic gun controls on guns, and the neg had to say no, which is not a great position, I don't think. In APTA, though, things can actually just be wildly unbalanced sometimes, depending on what your opponent wants to read. And so that means that you should be cognizant of that. And that has two implications in terms of how you should debate. The first is that when you're op, you will need to get out of your opponent's sandbox. If your opponent is competent and they are gov, they will expect you to make certain arguments, and they will know how to systematically and comprehensively beat those arguments. In PF, any argument can basically beat any other argument. Like, obviously, the construction of cases does matter, but there's not like, oh, I read hedge and they read warming, so like they win because warming beats hedge. Like that's not how PF works. It's not exactly how APTA works either, but it is true that when the gov gets to pick the topic area, they can design cases that are that just lead to the op saying certain things and then systematically losing with those things. So it is more important for you to be willing to explore non-stock stuff or try to frame the debate differently, given that is the case. And that's not an instinct that PF really prepares you for as much, because there's sort of the expectation that in PF, the topic is something that is reasonable and it's just there because, it's a sort of fair battleground to fight upon. The converse implication of it is that when you're gov, you should be willing to exploit that a little bit. And I don't mean like read super unbalanced cases all the time. Like that's not that fun necessarily. But it does mean that you should be willing to write topics or write cases that are not just the PF topic from last year. Like explore interests that maybe are outside of that, even if they're related to IR or econ or like PF sort of topic areas. You should be willing to delve into your own interests and read things that maybe don't seem exactly perfectly balanced. That's okay. And you can use that to your advantage. And it also means you can sort of design the debate. Like when you're writing a PF case, obviously you have certain arguments that you want to be because you hear them a lot, but you're not systematically sure of what your opponents are going to say. When you have the power to set a topic, there is at least, somewhat more of your opponent's strategy that you can control. And so you should be willing to use that power a little bit. The last thing I'll say is don't be too dismissive. What I mean by that is that I think there's a lot of topics that get read in APDA that PFers sort of like scoff at. And I know this because I was and maybe still am one of them. Like some of the stuff that's more pop culture-y, like I didn't really think it was super fun to debate or super rigorous or super deep. But I think like treating it as if it is some sort of second class thing, which you can kind of afford to blow off or that it's not even worth your time, just means you're going to lose a lot. So be willing to hear your opponents out and engage as honestly and as thoroughly as you can on any kind of topic area. I didn't enjoy a lot of the cases that I necessarily had to op, but I gave them my all and I didn't treat them as if they were sort of sideshows or second thoughts because that was how I would lose. And so being willing to entertain things that might be slightly unusual will, I think, be helpful for your ability to sort of not lose rounds that are otherwise winnable. So what will you be good at? That's sort of the second part of the lecture. I think there are three big things, and they all kind of resemble each other, or at least stem from similar parts. The first thing is that you'll be pretty good at collapsing and having round vision. I think there's this interesting thing where in world schools, the reply speech, is sort of the final speech in the round, is not really a speech where you necessarily collapse on one argument and explain how it outweighs everything else, like in a super technical fashion. It's more so sort of like a resummarization or recapitulation of the round with general explanations of why you win, but nowhere near the like level of strategic maneuvering and narrowing that exists in like a PF final focus. APDA hews much more to the PF final focus than to the world's reply, even though the speech time resembles the world's reply more. And that is something that you should and can exploit. The fact that you will be used to picking an argument and explaining how it beats everything else, or having the sense of which argument to pick in the first place, will help you tremendously. The second thing is technical skill. This just means like the ability to respond to an argument, the ability to say, turn, non-unique, delink, whatever. Like these kinds of terms and these kinds of understanding of how arguments fit together and how to construct an argument that is successful in technical terms. All of that is helpful. And there will be people who come onto APDA, like most people, I think, who will not have that level of familiarity with technical debate. And that's something you can exploit. The third thing is word economy and efficiency. PFers come in with exceptional word economy because they have to fit their things into 2-minute speeches, and now they have all this extra time. To some extent, like it is normal to get like slightly less efficient in APDA. Like that's something that is totally okay, as I said before. But it is something that does pose an advantage for you because you will spend a lot less time having to answer each argument, and therefore will be able to make or respond to a lot more arguments. So how do you exploit what you're good at beyond just like being good at those things? I think there's three things. The first thing is you should write complex and dense cases with many potential collapses that set you up. One of your advantages is you can write technically, and another one of the advantages is you can pick the right argument to go for. The way you should then exploit both these things together is when you are gov, write a lot of different collapses and write them quite densely and write like a lot of links and a lot of impacts and a lot of sort of preempts. This doesn't mean you should read super, super long or super, super fast cases, but it does mean that you shouldn't fall into what some other APDA folks might do, which is just like 3 very general arguments, because that's not really what your comparative advantage is. And so if you're willing to get into the muck a little bit, even if other folks you see aren't doing that as much, it probably will help you. Second thing is you will have to observe and use minor drops. This does not mean that you can get away with making arguments that last 5 seconds and then blowing them up later. People don't like that. But it does mean that if you make a bunch of arguments that are each 20, 30 seconds long, and then one of them kind of gets dropped, which happens quite often, and you spin that thing that was 30 seconds into something that was 2 minutes, actually then you can win, and a lot of the time you will. A lot of other folks will both drop arguments because they don't see each argument as that important, and also not recognize when drops are as important. Like even if you concede an argument, they often won't exploit it. I think PFers are very good at sort of smelling the figurative blood in the water and being able to continue using that skill, but also sort of implementing it in APTA terms as opposed to PF ones will help you. The third thing is you should present offense in the member speeches. The member speeches are the two middle speeches of the round. They're sort of like the rebuttals in PF. Rebuttals in PF require a lot of offense. It's kind of a dominant meta strategy these days. In APTA, I think a lot of people give member speeches that are still quite defensive. If you present a lot of offense in the member speeches, you will make it so that drops are much, much more punishing to your opponents. And that sort of feeds into the point two I said before, which is they are probably not as good at responding to a large suite of arguments as you are. And that matters more if each of those arguments is an offensive argument than if it is a defensive argument. So I think in particular for PFers or otherwise dense technical debate backgrounds, presenting a lot of offense in member speeches tends to amplify your comparative advantages. So then what will you be bad at? There's three things. The first thing is you will not sound like the kind of person a judge would want to vote for. You will use very annoying jargon. You will not sound like very pretty, but you will also just not be a very good communicator because I don't think PF prizes it. And you may be responding, well, I had to adapt. I had to debate for parent judges or flay judges or whatever. It's not the same. I think that kind of debating is, at least the way it's done in PF, is like actively trying to dumb down what you're saying. And I don't think that's what APTA adaptation is. APTA isn't about dumbing down. It is more so just about communicating as much as possible, like genuinely engaging in the act of communication and treating things as if not as a debate, like very much so a debate, not a speech event, but also not just a tactical checkers or chess game. And so I'll talk about what that sort of looks like later. But the broad takeaway is like things like uniqueness controls the direction of the link. There are a certain amount of APTA judges who would understand what you mean. There are zero APTA judges who would like hearing that. Maybe there are like two. I don't know, but very, very few. The second thing is you will often fall on the wrong side of a gut check. It's pretty normal to get gut checked by parents, but people sort of write that off as like a whatever, like a lay screw, or they complain about it and whatnot. And after you'll also just have like very, very good judges, very like renowned and esteemed judges who just say like this argument didn't make sense. This argument didn't persuade me. This argument doesn't clear this intuitive leap. And so you will often make arguments that are quite stupid, transparently, and you will find yourself losing rounds that you thought you should have won on that. And so you should be willing to not think, well, I should have won on this trick that I read, and think instead, well, maybe it's not the format that has existed for 20 years that is wrong, or the judge who has won multiple ODs or whatever who is wrong. Maybe it's me. So being willing to enter with that humility is already a good first step. The third thing is you're probably not great at dealing with stylistic difference. PF has stylistic difference between different judges, like a lay round versus a tech round is very stylistically different. But the fact that these speeches are so short very much condenses how different people can debate. I think at this point, most national circuit rounds are sort of indistinguishable. The sort of main distinction is whether it's progressive or not, which doesn't really factor into APTA, so it doesn't really square with this sort of mental model. But like in APTA, you'll just find people who just speak very, very slowly and very persuasively, and who still manage to win rounds, even technically, on that basis. And people who debate very quickly, even quicker than some circuit PFers. And you will find people who read cases about subjects that really just make no sense to you. And you'll find people who read cases that are exclusively about econ or IR or exclusively about philosophy. And all these things are different and weird. And it means that you will have to go into each round with far more mental flexibility than you otherwise would in PF, where, for better or for worse, you kind of know what your opponents are going to debate like as a broad thing. There are exceptions, but I think generally speaking, that is an important concept. So then how do you survive being bad at these things? The first thing I touched on earlier, which is to watch and learn. If your opponents are winning rounds because they are speaking slowly, but still being exceptionally persuasive and winning because they just know their things inside and out, and they're very concretely able to explain why they're just right and you're just wrong, that's not them like pulling a fast one on you. That's them doing debate well, and there are things you can learn from them. And so watching people who have these different styles, I think, will help you tremendously with becoming a better APDA debater, but also just a generally better communicator. The second thing is to think about arguments in terms of smart versus clever. In PF, I think there is a single scale for how good an argument is. It's just the strategic value of that argument. And there's multiple inputs into that output, but that's the most important thing. APTA, obviously strategic value matters, but there's also a sort of separate axis of how true, at a real world, this is intuitive, this makes sense, is your argument. Clever arguments are arguments that have very high strategic value. Smart arguments are arguments that just can cohere very well with the world or just well warranted in ways that are sort of intuitively and intrinsically true. Now, obviously, smart arguments are also strategic for other reasons, right? It's harder to answer them, for example. But a lot of the time, I think people in PF can kind of elide these two values and kind of consider them both as similar things. Whereas in APTA, I think there are judges who genuinely just treat them very differently, who will just hate you kind of reading clever strategic framing tricks that just aren't really true, but you can maybe plausibly warrant, but will really, really like you presenting a in-depth, true account of something. And there are judges who will just think the converse as well. So being willing to sort of interrogate your own arguments and think, well, okay, so if I was my opponent, what would I say about this? Does this intuitively make sense to me? Do I sound like I would be right about this question? Those are things that you should be thinking about more in APTA than you do in PF. The third thing is more of a small thing, but it does help, which is when you're faced with these sort of unfamiliar topic areas or unfamiliar styles, and you don't really know what to do, and especially because you haven't debated this kind of topic area before and you don't have evidence to fall back on. One thing that can be helpful is just to ask questions. POC periods are 15 minutes, and people often take them to just prep, and then they write these LOCs that just don't end up factoring into the debate at all because they didn't really know what the debate was about in the first place. I think especially for PFers or folks who are just more unfamiliar with that kind of more original or unintuitive debating, asking a few questions beforehand, trying to clarify what side is what, trying to get a sense of what the arguments might look like, that kind of thing can help you sort of get your sea legs and make you a more effective debater going forward. So that's all I have. This is all reasonably surface level. There's a lot more to be said about the transition, but I do think the broad takeaway is PF gives you a great set of skills, and there are obviously adjustments you will need to make, but it is totally in your own hands. If you want to be successful at APTA with the PF skills you have, you will be able to do so if you put the effort in and you put the thought in. And I really do hope that you all try it out if you are sort of in doubt watching this video, because I do think that it sort of scratches both similar and different parts of your brain as PF, and has a lot of the sort of benefits of getting to compete and getting to think about issues and getting to play a strategic game without some of the downsides of the more rote, I've done a month on this topic, everything is the same at this point, or prepping the endless frontline files or block files or whatever that PF sort of forces you into. So yeah, if you have any questions about this lecture or about PF or about APTA or just generally, again, feel free to message me, and thank you.